The early 1980s was the age of bedroom coders. All you needed was a crap computer and a dream. A flood of cheap 8-bit machines had arrived, and there was no better way to occupy a dark winter evening after school. You could play games on them. Sure, they were of questionable quality, but this was the 80s. The alternatives were bleak. Besides, if you became dissatisfied with the games on offer, you could always make your own. The 8-bit micros were relatively simple, and the bar for quality non-existent. So the hobbyists stepped up, and as the market grew, so did the earning potential. You'd hear stories of teenage programmers striking it rich with hit games. Everyone wanted to make the next Manic Miner. Of course, most games made peanuts, a couple £100 maybe. But to a young programmer, that was a fortune. And besides, it beats getting a paper round. One such hopeful teen was Chris Sawyer. In 1983, at the age of 15, he'd saved enough of his pocket money to buy his own computer. It was a Computer's Lynx, an obscure 8-bit micro that lasted about a year with only 30,000 sold. Not the best place to launch a commercial games career, but a chance to scratch a programming itch. A little while later, he acquired another obscure 8-bit machine, the Memotech MTX, notable for its inclusion of a Z80 assembler. This made writing machine code much easier. Instead of using an interpreted language like BASIC, directly instructing the Z80 CPU meant that programs could run much faster. And this was the key to making fast-paced arcade-style games on these primitive machines. And that's exactly what Chris did. He spent most of 1984 to 1985 making versions of arcade games for his MTX. Missile Command, a misspelled clone of the more famous Atari original. Quogo, based on Qbert. A Space Invaders-style shoot-'em-up called Arcasion. And a Scramble clone, Target Zone. He also made games loosely inspired by popular Spectrum titles. Escape from Zarkos is a Manic Miner-inspired platformer. Ultimate Play the Game seemed to have been a major source of influence. Chamberoids is reminiscent of Attic Attack, and its sequel, Revenge of the Chamberoids, along with Sepulchrae Celeratae, have an isometric view in the vein of Night Law. Chris's games may not have been particularly original, but they were well programmed. He had nearly a dozen games published on the Memotech MTX, making him one of the more prolific contributors to the platform. The revenue was, however, unspectacular, earning him enough for a new printer and disk drive. By 1986, Chris was 18, and his output slowed a little as he attended university. Appropriately enough, he studied computer science and microprocessor systems. During this time, he bought an Amstrad CPC, a more mainstream 8-bit platform. He developed a couple of games for it, Sepulchrae and Ziggurat, both isometric action adventures. It was at university where Chris was also introduced to the world of IBM PCs. He designed and programmed a PC game as part of his work experience, and eventually bought his own IBM-compatible machine. While most of his programming had been for Z80 CPUs, he quickly familiarized himself with the PC's x86 architecture, and by the time he graduated, he was adept enough to start developing for the PC. IBM compatibles were rocketing in popularity at the time, but not for their gaming prowess. They were office machines suited to spreadsheets and word processing. Fast arcade graphics were a big ask of early PCs, but as the market expanded and hardware improved, the demand for IBM-compatible games was rising. To meet this demand, games from platforms more suited to arcade gameplay were ported to the PC. But this needed a programmer capable of extracting every ounce of performance. Chris Sawyer was perfect for the task. He had a low-level understanding of the x86 architecture and plenty of experience cloning games. His first PC port was Virus in 1988. Originally known as Zark on its native Archimedes, it was a 3D shoot-'em-up by David Braben of Elite fame. On a fast 286 with an EGA card, the 3D graphics were smooth and the gameplay as good as rival platforms. Not bad for a business machine. Chris's next port was 1989's Star Ray, also known as Revenge of Defender. A classic arcade shoot-'em-up with some pretty nice parallax scrolling. In 1990, Xenomorph and Conqueror followed, sci-fi role-playing and Virus with tanks, respectively. In 1991, Flight Sim Birds of Prey, and an upgraded version of the classic Elite for PC players in Elite Plus. Chris had a good working relationship with David Braben, having done the PC port of both Virus and Elite. So when it came to Elite's sequel, Frontier, Chris was once again the natural choice. As it turns out, he was well suited to porting. He had the necessary technical skill and was modest enough to deliver faithful renditions of other people's games. It's fair to say that, thus far, Sawyer was not a huge creative force. His 8-bit games were largely arcade clones, and his work for the PC extended only to conversions. The man was not devoid of ideas, however. In between his conversion projects, he had started work on his own original game. It was a transport simulation sandbox, known in development as Interactive Transport Simulation. Microprose expressed an interest in publishing Chris's game, although they did have some input over what he should call it. So, in 1994, Transport Tycoon was released. It was heavily inspired by games like Railroad Tycoon and SimCity, but Chris's fascination with isometric graphics and adroit programming elevated his game. It was a simple concept: lay tracks and set trains upon them. But the game had unprecedented scale and detail that served as the perfect sandbox. It was Railroad Tycoon, but better, a true evolution of the business sim genre. Along with SimCity 2000, Transport Tycoon raised the bar for the genre. It was a great time for PC gaming. Doom had just released. Many were buying new PCs or upgrading to 486s with VGA cards, and sandbox games were en vogue. Even so, Chris was prepared to go back to doing conversions if Transport Tycoon didn't work out. But luckily, it did. It wasn't a runaway success, but it performed quite well, particularly in the UK and Europe. Sales were brisk enough for Microprose to release a World Editor expansion pack and an expanded version with extra features in Transport Tycoon Deluxe. Transport Tycoon is a fondly remembered gem of the emergence of popular PC gaming. It was polished, open-ended, and a step above the sandbox games that came before. Perhaps that's why people still play it today. That and the effort behind OpenTTD, an open-source enhancement of the original that runs on modern machines. So anyway, what do you do after you release a successful game? Naturally, you start work on a sequel. Chris had a few ideas that didn't make it into the original, principally better handling of 3D terrain so that road and rail could intertwine effortlessly. But at some point he became disillusioned with the project. He'd spent the last few years working on Transport Tycoon, and his motivation had started to wane. So he bought himself out of the sequel's contract and went travelling for a while. And it was at this point he discovered a love of roller coasters. As it turns out, simulating roller coasters isn't so different from trains. There's tracks, carriages, and stations all the same. So Chris's next game would be a roller coaster sim under the working title of White Knuckle. He had some concerns that it might end up as a niche game that only catered to coaster fans, but that didn't matter. His interest had been captured. Work on what would be RollerCoaster Tycoon had begun. Like Chris's previous games, RollerCoaster Tycoon was almost entirely developed in assembly. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with this. Ultimately, code is code, and Chris was just working with what he knew. But over the last decade, the advantages of working in assembly had largely evaporated. CPUs were not only faster, but more complex. Pentiums had pipelining and superscalar execution. This meant that instructions could be executed in parallel, out of order. So it was increasingly difficult for a human programmer to extract optimum performance by directly instructing the CPU. Modern compilers, on the other hand, were becoming increasingly efficient. So assembly was more difficult, less portable, and had lost its speed advantage. By now, most games were written in C++, and assembly was reserved for short inline sections of code. RollerCoaster Tycoon might be the last major commercial game written in assembly. It's more than a hugely impressive technical feat, though. It also happens to be a wonderful game. There are dozens of types of roller coasters to build, and the construction of your park is intuitive. The coasters twist and turn as you put them together piece by piece, and everything is linked by pathways and queues. Some strategically placed shops and facilities, the little patrons will mill around and have the time of their life. The isometric graphics have plenty of charm, and the entire experience is frustration-free and rewarding. As long as you don't scrutinize the game systems too closely, there are some quirks. It's a wonderfully complex game that allows for true sandbox creativity. Chris's worry about its niche appeal was misplaced. As it turns out, building roller coasters is fun, and no game had ever done it better. This was a game with mass appeal, and the PC market was broader than ever. RollerCoaster Tycoon hit the charts, and it stayed there for months. It ended up being the best-selling PC game of 1999, selling over 700,000 copies in the US alone. And it was evergreen. It kept on selling. By July 2002, it had sold over 4 million copies, and Chris had made around $30 million in royalties. So anyway, what do you do after you release a successful game? You do a sequel, naturally. RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 followed in 2002, and on the face of it appears to be a very similar game. It uses the same engine, the graphics are consistent. It's difficult to tell them apart at first glance. There are a host of improvements, however. New scenarios, new rides and attractions, and a more flexible building system. It was generally received well, although there were complaints that the graphics were starting to look dated, and that it might be time to make the leap to 3D instead. Nevertheless, it sold well, not quite as well as the first game, but significantly enough to end up as the 10th best-selling computer game of 2002. It was clear that isometric graphics were falling out of favour, however, and that 3D graphics should replace them. This was not a challenge that interested Chris, however, so for RollerCoaster Tycoon 3, he took on a consultant role instead. Frontier Developments handled the project, David Braben's studio. They took the RollerCoaster Tycoon formula into the third dimension. It was successful, although I do feel some of the charm of the isometric games was lost. At the very least, the game had been modernised, and the first-person perspective that was now possible allowed you to ride your own coaster creations. Reviews were generally positive, and sales were strong. But under Atari's watch, the series would never hit the same highs as the original. Meanwhile, Chris was working on what would be his final game. Locomotion, a spiritual successor to Transport Tycoon, presented in the same way as RollerCoaster Tycoon. It wasn't received particularly well. It had been a decade since the original Transport Tycoon, and the same isometric presentation was written off as dated. It's a shame because I'm quite fond of it. It's one of my favourite games. But the world had moved on. Chris had already made it big with RollerCoaster Tycoon. He'd made his money and was set for life. Isometric games had fallen out of favour, the advantages in developing an assembly were long gone, and Chris had never been the most creative mind when it came to developing original games. Coupled with a royalty dispute with Atari, Sawyer's appetite for further development had dwindled to nothing. And so, Chris decided to take a break. Maybe it was for the best. The games industry had radically changed since the days of the bedroom coder. There was no hope of striking it rich left for a solo developer. If you look at the top-selling PC games of 1999, you can see how the scale had shifted. SimCity 3000, Age of Empires 2, System Shock 2 were made by teams 100 strong, with 10 or more programmers on board. RollerCoaster Tycoon was essentially made by 3 people. Chris Sawyer did the design and programming. Simon Foster did the graphics, Alistair Brimble did the music. And despite this, RollerCoaster Tycoon was the best-selling PC game in 1999. Really, it was the last of its kind. For better or for worse, commercial video games had reached a level of complexity that surpassed the abilities of a single person. But thankfully, things have changed. The internet is widespread, digital marketplaces like Steam have become widely accepted. Independent developers no longer need a publisher to reach the mass market. Once again, with enough hard work and passion, a lone developer can make a successful game. It's not easy. Most indie developers make next to nothing, and the breakaway hit that sells millions is rare. But it is possible. And besides, it beats getting a paper round. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, farewell.